Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Tonight is the last weekly Torah class of this year, of 5781. So it better be a good one, hopefully. Next week, we will not be having class. We'll be doing talking and eating. Next Tuesday night will be the second night of Rosh Hashanah. The subsequent class will be in 2 weeks, the night before 2 nights before Yom Kippur. Or is that? No, it's the night before Yom Kippur. So tonight's class is on the Torah portion of Nitzavim, which is the fourth to final Torah portion of the entire Torah. But as we shall soon see, it is also about Rosh Hashanah. And we will begin, as we always do, with an overview of this week's Torah portion, followed by the topic in depth of which we will be exploring tonight. The overview of the holiday, it's an overview of Rosh Hashanah, not of the Torah portion. The festival of Rosh Hashanah, the name of Rosh Hashanah does not mean New Year's, does not mean the beginning of the year. The name means the head of the year. Is observed for 2 days, beginning on the 1st of Tishrei, the first day of the Jewish year. It is the anniversary of the creation of Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, the first man and woman, and their first actions towards the realization of mankind's role in God's world. Rosh Hashanah thus emphasizes the special relationship between God and humanity. Our dependence upon God as our creator and sustainer, and God's so-called dependence upon us as the one who make his presence known and felt in his world. Each year on Rosh Hashanah, all inhabitants of the world pass before God like a flock of sheep, and it is decreed in the heavenly court, who shall live and who shall die, who shall be impoverished and who shall be enriched, who shall fall and who shall rise. But there's also the day that we proclaim God, King of the universe. The Kabbalists teach that the continued existence of the universe is dependent upon the renewal of the divine desire for a world where we accept God's kingship each year on Rosh Hashanah. The central observance of Rosh Hashanah is the sounding of the shofar, the ram's horn, which also represents the trumpet blast of a people's coronation of their king. The cry of the shofar is also a call to repentance, for Rosh Hashanah is also the anniversary of man's first sin and his repentance thereof, and serves as the first of the 10 days of repentance, which culminate in Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. As such, that Rosh Hashanah, the main observance, essential observance of Rosh Hashanah is sounding the shofar. Parenthetically, I guess everyone's welcome to join us for services. If you haven't yet, please let us know you're coming so we can prepare adequately. That will be in the backyard both mornings, September 7th and 8th, Tuesday and Wednesday, as well as both evenings, 5:30 on our front lawn. We will be having the shofar blowing, just a shofar ceremony, short 10-15 minutes. And everyone is welcome to join for that. Even if you won't be attending services this year, you're worried about the crowds or whatnot, please join us in the front yard. There'll be ample space outdoors, and everyone can fulfill this central observance of Rosh Hashanah. Getting right into it, this week's in-depth analyzation. Oh, there's more about it. Another significance of the shofar is to recall the binding of Isaac, which also occurred on Rosh Hashanah, in which a ram took Isaac's place as an offering to God. We evoke Abraham's readiness to sacrifice his son and plead that the merit of his deed should stand by us as we pray for a year of life, health, and prosperity. Altogether, we listen to 100 shofar blasts over the course of Rosh Hashanah services, and that is each day. Additional Rosh Hashanah observances include eating a piece of apple dipped in honey to symbolize our desire for a sweet year, and eating other special foods symbolic of the New Year's blessings. B, blessing one another with the words L'shana tova, tikatei, v'teichatem. May you be inscribed and sealed for a good year. C, tashlich, a special prayer said near a body of water, an ocean, a river, a pond, etc., in evocation of the verse and you shall cast their sins into the depths of the sea. Just a quick note on that. You don't have to throw anything into the water. We don't literally throw anything in the water. It's figurative. It's symbolic. But no, we don't throw anything into the water. And as with every major Jewish holiday, after candle lighting and prayers, we recite Kiddush and make a blessing on Challah to begin the festive Rosh Hashanah meals. And so Rosh Hashanah is quite the holiday. But what does that have to do with this week's Torah portion and tonight's topic, which is a particularly important topic? And that is society we are in now. The current atmosphere is quite divisive in various areas, whether it's politics, whether it's health, whether it's personalities. We have lots of things to be divisive about. Unfortunately, society as a whole has become terribly divisive. Discourse has become vitriolic, and it seems to be growing steadily worse as the years go on. It's in the past few years. I don't know the way it was back in the 40s and the 30s, but they say it's pretty bad these days. And I can tell you firsthand, and I'm sure we all can, we've experienced it, sadly, how terrible the discourse can become. And so with Rosh Hashanah being a time to reflect on the past year and project on the coming year, on how we can learn from this past year's mistakes or see what we've done in this past year and do it better this coming year, we can analyze how difficult these past years have been for the entire world. And these past years, how this past year particularly, how divisive the discussion and conversation may have become, the discourse may have become. And in some cases, people have turned against each other, people who've been friends for decades, people who've been relatives, close relatives, not just friends, but friends and relatives, have turned against each other, no longer talking, no longer inviting for meals, no longer being friendly with one another. How do we stop this trend? How can we shift our perspective and become more united as a society? What can Rosh Hashanah help us with understanding on what steps we can take and what perspective we can have to kind of take this other and otherness, which exists and to a degree is important, and ensure that it doesn't highlight our differences, but rather enable us to become a cohesive unit, a united society. So we may not figure out the world's problems tonight, but we'll definitely come away with a perspective, perhaps a paradigm shift that will enable us to approach all types of conversations, and not just conversations, but ideas and understandings in a better way, gleaning from this week's Torah portion and the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, which reminds me of a story. There were two. There was a couple that for 10 years, everyone knew that if you want to hear good shouting matches, walk by their home. You walk by their home and you're going to hear these epic shouting matches about everything, whether it's where the mugs should go on the counter or what day the United States should pull out of Afghanistan. You name it, there was an epic shouting match between the spouses in this home. And lo and behold, it's been 10 years, 11 years, and suddenly it gets quiet. And they see the couple walking nicely and quietly and amicably. They're talking and they're going shopping together. And the neighborhood is excited about this development. And so the one yenta, the block, has the audacity, the chutzpah, and walks over to Mrs. Stein and says, so Mrs. Stein, tell me, how'd you manage to do this? How'd you suddenly get quiet and things are working out? She says, well, we went to a marriage counselor and gave us wonderful advice, and it's been working beyond our expectations. The yenta says, really, Mrs. Stein, what was this advice? And Mrs. Stein says, well, the advice was that I should make the small decisions and my husband will make the big decisions. And it's been working wonderfully. Really, she says. So tell me, Mrs. Stein, what are the small decisions? She says, well, I decide where the kids should go to school, and I decide who washes the dishes, and I decide where we should live and where we should go on vacation and what we should do with our retirement funds, and so on and so forth. She says, wow, those are all the small decisions. And what are the big decisions that your husband decides? She says, well, he decides American foreign policy. He decides American economic policy. So tonight, we're not going to decide any foreign policy or economic policy or any other policy for that matter, but we'll definitely have a positive perspective on how to change the world. And where do we get that perspective from? We look in the Torah. Which aspect of Torah do we look to get the perspective? If you have the textbook, it's on page 160. So we'll begin with a quote from Rabbi Yeshayahu Halevi Horowitz, famously known by the acronym of his book, the Shalah. It was a famed 16th century whom we've quoted many, many times. And the Shalah says as follows: the cycle of annual festivals, whether biblical or rabbinic, as well as the fast days, including the 9th of Av, are associated with the Torah portion that we chant on the Shabbat closest to that day. You see, we read the Torah portion, it's roughly 54 Torah portions during the 54 weeks of the year. Some weeks, some years there are less weeks, some years there are more weeks, owing to the fact that there are leap years. And so some years we have more weeks and some less, but roughly it's 54 weeks. But because of the fluctuations of the calendar, certain Torah portions are set and other Torah portions can happen at various times. For example, this Torah portion of Nitzavim, which is the fourth to final Torah portion, must always be read the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. So no matter the calendar layout, if it's a leap year, if it's not a leap year, if Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbat, if it's not on Shabbat, last week's Torah portion may or may not be 2 weeks before. Different Torah portions throughout Leviticus can be at different times of the year, some before Purim, some after Purim. Some years, the Torah portion of Shemini will be before Passover. Some years, the Torah portion of Shemini will be after Passover. Because of fluctuations in the calendar, many Torah portions fluctuate. But when it comes to certain Torah portions, including ours, the rabbis have instituted that it must be read. The calendar is always set up in such a way that it must be read the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. Why is that? And so this is what the Shalah is explaining. It's like that because anything that happens in the coming week is associated with the Torah portion that is read on that week. And so if Rosh Hashanah is in this coming week, that means the Torah portion that we will be reading on Shabbat has a reference to Rosh Hashanah. It's associated with Rosh Hashanah. And not only that, even mundane things that happen, birthdays, yahrzeits, world events, are alluded to in those weeks' Torah portion by divine providence. And so in our Torah portion, where do we find Rosh Hashanah mentioned? Here's the first verses of our Torah portion, text 2. Atem nitzavim, the Torah portion nitzavim gets its name from the second word in this week's Torah portion. Atem nitzavim, you are standing on this day all together before God, your God, the leaders of your tribes, your elders, and your officers, every man of Israel, your young children, your women, and your convert who is within your camp, your woodcutters, and your water drawers. This passage is describing a gathering that took place on the day that Moshe passed away. Just before Moses' passing, which took place in Adar, which is a week before Purim, that's when this Torah portion takes place. So what does this passage have to do with Rosh Hashanah? Here we go. It's from a great Hasidic sage, but this idea is taken from many years earlier. The Talmud touches upon this idea and says as follows: it is well known that wherever the Torah employs the phrase this day, it refers to Rosh Hashanah. On Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, we read You are standing on this day to teach us that as we approach Rosh Hashanah, every person must stand before God. And so when we say in this verse that you are standing on this day all together before God, your God, this is a reference to Rosh Hashanah as well, that on Rosh Hashanah, we are all standing together before God. What does it mean to say when it says every person must stand before God, that we're all standing before God? There are many ways to understand this term. But in context with tonight's class, we're going to focus on the understanding that it means to adopt God's perspective of mankind. What does that mean? Here's Moshe gathering together the Jewish people just before his passing. And he's delineating all the categories of people, many types of people that comprise a society, excuse me. There's leaders, there's the elders, there's the men, the women, the children, there's the water carriers, those who do the menial work, etc. They each take a different view and a different approach to life. Some are wiser, some are more resourceful, some are more capable. But somehow, they all stand before God and they all stand together. How are they all able to stand together, which would imply that they're all standing equally? They all perceive each other as equals. How do they pull this off? By standing before God. The way they can stand all together equally is because they are standing before God. Namely, they're adopting God's perspective. And because they adopt God's perspective, they are able to stand all together equally. What is God's perspective? So the Midrash tells us as follows, text 4. Even though I appointed leaders, elders, and officers over you, you are all equal in my eyes. As the verse says, every Jewish person. These verses, the leading verses of our Torah portion, it delineates all these types of peoples, elders, leaders, officers, men, women, children, water carriers, etc. But it also says every Jewish person. Because yes, some may be wiser, some more capable, some more resourceful, some more artistic, etc., etc. Nonetheless, every Jewish person, they're all equal. Because all people are equal in God's eyes. See, from the human perspective, we see differences. And sometimes we see unbridgeable differences between us. That's from the human perspective. But from God's perspective, God sees us all equal. When we see people, we see someone who's smarter, someone who's wiser. We see someone who's craftier, someone who's more practical. And we see people who agree with us. We see people who don't agree with us. We see people from our family. We see people who are not. We see people who are our type of people. And we see people who are not our type of people. But God sees everyone equally. He created us all. He created us all with these differences. He created differences in talents and ages, in appearances and abilities and capabilities. Not because he wanted the world to be unequal, but precisely because he wanted each person to be capable in one area, unique in one area, suited for a specific task that no one else is perfect for that specific task in that specific time, age, and place. He made us each unique. Some are suited to be leaders, some are suited to be followers. Some are suited to be menial workers, some are suited to be academics, and so on and so forth in every area in life. Just because some are leaders and some are followers, it doesn't make those people better than the other, because the world needs every kind. And only when all slots are filled can the world work smoothly. The world isn't less complete if it's lacking a leader than if it's lacking a water carrier. That doesn't turn the water carrier into a leader. It doesn't turn a child into an adult or an adult into a child, but it does mean that they're equally critical for the function, for the world to function. And so when we survey society and we see differences, and we focus on the differences in station and rank and personality, we're seeing it from a godless perspective. But when we stand before God and we look at it from a godly perspective, as we ought to, before Rosh Hashanah, leading up to Rosh Hashanah, what we see is a well-oiled machine with equally critical parts. That's what we're seeing. That is God's perspective. Why does God have this unity perspective? Why is his perspective so radically different from ours? Obviously, it's God, so we can't necessarily understand it fully, but it's best to attempt to see, explore of where God's unique perspective comes from. And so we'll begin with text 5, a quote from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe explains as follows. They, the other side, not the side of divine energy, gather from the multiplicious world into which their mindsets had dipped. This one inclined this way, and that one the other way, etc. And they form instead a singular domain in keeping with the divine oneness. It's in a much greater context, but the idea that the Alter Rebbe is explaining here, that the Tanya is explaining, that this quote is explaining, is that God is uniquely singular. And as such, because God is singular, God created everything. And so everything that God created is also singular. Yes, he created a pluralistic world with many different kinds, which gives us the supposition as if we are inherently dissimilar. But when we stand before God and we focus our attention on God, who's the source, the creator of all beings, we're able to focus on this idea that deep down, we're all one. We're all created by God. We're all created for a general purpose and a general mission, just like a playwright when he writes his characters into the story. They're all part of the story. They all fit into his singular scheme. So too with God. We are all part of God's story. And so we ought to have this divine perspective. If we focus and we attempt to have this divine perspective, that's when we're all united. Easier said than done. Sounds wonderful. We're one big oiled machine, and each component is equally critical. Wonderful. Practically speaking, how do we adopt this perspective? And what are some concrete steps we can take to achieve this perspective, or at least an iota of this perspective? It reminds me of the academic in child psychology. It's a joke I've repeated many times, but it's definitely worth repeating once again. Professor Finkelstein, he was an illustrious professor, and he would teach on how careful you have to be with children and how wonderful they are and how soft-spoken you ought to be with them, even while disciplining them, choosing your words wisely. And one day they're putting down new concrete on the front of his home. And his little grandchild runs through the wet concrete. He loses it and he starts shouting at the kid as if this kid was an animal, who knows what. It's His wife comes running, lifts the kid out of the concrete, calms him down, and walks over to her husband and says, honey, I don't understand. You always talk about how much love and care and concern you have to give to the children and how soft-spoken you have to be. What's going on? And he says, that's all in the abstract, not in the concrete. So what are some concrete steps? What are some ideas? What mind shift can we make to help us adopt this divine perspective? And so we're going to present 4 strategies that's going to be in a way of escalation that will show us each one progressively more challenging than the next, but enable us to have this divine perspective, at least somewhat. Text 6 continues with Rabbi Aaron of Karlin, who we quoted earlier, and he presents the following metaphor. An analogy was offered by my predecessor, the righteous and holy Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin of blessed memory. A king wanted to reach a very high shelf, but did not have a tall enough ladder. What did he do? He instructed many people to stand on each other's shoulders until the one at the top reached the item. Though the person at the top accomplished the goal, one cannot say that the person on the ground is superfluous. For if he would walk away, all would have fallen. What he's saying here is very simple. We're all on the same totem pole. When we encounter people who we deem inferior, who we feel are inferior to us, whether it's in their ideas, whether it's in their job, whether it's in their position, whatever we feel is what's making them inferior to us, we're tempted to dismiss them, dismiss their ideas, dismiss their personality, dismiss who they are, their value, etc. But we have to remember, says Rabbi Aaron Karlin, this is the first strategy, we have to remember that our superior contribution, in our perspective that is only because beneath us, the inferior ones are doing what they ought to do. They're providing all our basic needs. If they weren't providing our basic needs, we wouldn't be able to accomplish what we think we're accomplishing, right? The greatest academic can't accomplish something if he doesn't have running water. So the people doing that job, in his mind, the people working on the pipes may be inferior to him because they're not these great academics lecturing to thousands of students. But if he didn't have a microphone, and if he didn't have electricians who were working on the microphones, if he didn't have the janitor cleaning the hall in which he was giving these lectures, he wouldn't be able to give these lectures. And so we're all part of the same totem pole. Without the people on the bottom, the people on the top wouldn't be able to accomplish. Now, this is a nice idea. So it's a beginner's strategy, but it's just that, it's beginners. Why is it beginners? Because it has many drawbacks. First and foremost, if I'm on the top of the totem pole, I tower over other people. I am truly superior. There are people who are truly inferior. I can look down at those people. Their services may be essential to get the system running, but I'm more important. And so on the one hand, it does help a certain level of unity, but it doesn't really contribute to equality. And so let's move on to the second strategy, and we're going to turn to the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi. And he says the following in a discourse, text 7. There is a great principle in the realm of holiness. The end is wedged in the beginning so that it has no beginning and no end. It is circular because it stems from God, who envelops the entire world. When we abnegate our ego and are humble before our fellow, to the point that no one is higher or lower than another, we become part of the sacred oneness that has no beginning and no end. The first strategy was that there's a totem pole and the top needs the bottom. The second strategy, says the Alter Rebbe, takes it to a whole new level. Let's shift our perspective from linear to circular. Rather than thinking of others as lower and us as higher, or others as higher and us as lower, however one may perceive it, or we perceive some as lower and some as higher than us, let us think of everyone as part of a circle. Everyone is part of this circle. A circle is all encompassing. It contains all kinds. It has every type of person in it. And it's absolutely equal. There's no beginning or end, top or bottom to a circle. True equality. So if we view society as linear, the wise on top, the more capable on top, the foolish on the bottom, the more menial on the bottom, however some may put the academics on the bottom and the menial on the top, each one with their own understanding of society. When we put society and we view society as linear, we're not doing a good job, because some are on the top, some are on the bottom. The moment we take those two ends, the one that's all the way on the top is attached with the one that's all the way on the bottom, and we make a circle, we view society as a circular society. There's no top, there's no bottom, there's no beginning, there's no end. By definition, everyone is equal. I may be a professor, I may be a janitor, you may be a professor, you may be a janitor, but in a circular world, both roles are necessary, and because they're both necessary, they're equally important. None is greater or weaker than the other. And so it's up to us. If we view ourselves as equal, if we attach ourselves to the divine perspective that it's all circular, there's no higher, there's no lower, and it's perfect equality. But the question still is, understanding that society is circular is wonderful. But that's because Torah is telling us that society is circular. Torah is telling us that God's perspective is that society is circular, and if it's circular, we're all equal. But why is that? If it's truly a totem pole, you can't just take a totem pole and turn it circular. If it isn't circular, it isn't circular. We can't perceive it as circular if it isn't really so. So why is it truly circular? What's the logic behind saying that it's circular? And so strategy one is that everyone is necessary. Strategy two is taking it a step further and saying not only is everyone necessary, but it's not linear, it's circular. Strategy three is we're going to explain the logic why we're saying it's circular. And that is from a continuation of passage 7, text 8, also from the Alter Rebbe. By way of analogy, consider the human gestalt from head to foot. Though the feet are at the bottom and the head is at the top and is superior, nevertheless, in at least one aspect, the feet are superior to the head. The head needs the feet to carry it to where it needs to go and to hold it upright. In addition, if there is an illness in the head, it can sometimes be corrected through procedures performed on the foot, which means that in some respects, the head is nurtured by the foot and is incomplete without it. Similarly, our people are a single, complete gestalt. Even if we consider ourselves as a head compared to others, we are incomplete without them. If we seek it, we will find a deficiency within us that the others complete. This is a wild idea. It's not just that we're all equal parts in a well-oiled machine. It's like we're limbs of the same body. We're limbs of the same body. If one limb is missing, the other limb is incomplete. If the head doesn't have the feet, the head can't move. It can't dance. It may be the smartest head, it may be the wisest head, the most creative head, but it still cannot dance. It is incomplete. When one limb is missing the other, it's incomplete. Let's not look at it as a totem pole, as a ladder with steps. Let's look at it as limbs in a body. Every limb has its own task. Every limb is unique. And every limb needs the other limb. It's interlocked with what we do. What we do in our individual sphere is interlocked with and contributes to every other limb and their work. And so each one of us, every job that we do, every aspect of our personality, every aspect of our doings is interlocked and contributes to everyone else's doings and actions and personalities. Not only do feet raise the head like a ladder on the totem pole, a step on the totem pole, step on a ladder, but the feet contribute to the health of the head, as we mentioned earlier. Let's take a football team and use that as an example. When you have a football team, you have various positions, right? I'm not a big football fan. I don't know much about it. I used to play it a lot in school and high school, but there's various positions, right? There's the quarterback, the running back, there's the offense, the defense. The quarterback may be known as the most famous position, but you know what? Without a good offense, the quarterback is meaningless. And you can have the best offense, but without a good quarterback, it's meaningless. Doesn't have a good arm, he's not going to get the ball too far. Without a running back, without every position on the field, each one is crucial for the success of their mission, namely to win the game. When they're on that game, when they're on that field and they're playing that game, they know that every single one of them is crucial. Without the other, they're pointless. They're incomplete. They can't fulfill their mission. And a great example is if you go onto a field during practice, what do? They take the team itself is practicing. And so what do? They take the team, split it in two, and now they have the two halves of the same team competing against each other. And what's the purpose? To hone their skills, to test their capabilities, and to practice their strategies to see if it's going to work and if they can work together. And so when they're playing against their own teammates to hone their skills, it's fierce. They're in it all the way. They're trying to win. The half of the team is trying to win over the other half of the team. But then at the end of the day, it's just practice. And so what happens? If they win the game and the other half loses, it's not like, how we won, you lost. It's let's work together and let's hone our skills together to see where we can be better on offense, where we can better on defense. Let's learn how to, the defense learns how to elude the offense learns how to overpower the defense. They may seem like opposing teams, but they're working together and helping each other reach a common goal. On the field, it may look like they're enemies, but they're not. They each understand that they need each other regardless of where they are in that circular idea or which limb they are in the body. And so we need to think of society the way we think about the human body, the way we think about the football team. There may be perspectives that are radically different from our perspectives, but rather than argue with people who hold these perspectives, dismiss them or treat them as inferior, let's view society as a team. Let's view society as one collective body. It's not that the world needs all kinds, it's that we need all kinds. We are incomplete without those other kinds. The clarity we have on a subject The balance we strive to get with our opinions are all aided and completed by listening to and interacting with people who disagree with us. No, there's got to be a red line. It's a great idea. Theoretically, this idea is important. We are all limbs of the same body. Where do we draw the red line? That's where we have Torah. And Torah says there are certain opinions that are objectionable. There are certain opinions that Torah tells us are non-acceptable. So opinions that Torah tells us are not acceptable, those we can say that we still have to accept them or grapple with them. If Torah says we can't grapple with them, if Torah says we can't accept them, or they're categorically objectionable or divisive, they can't be tolerated. But barring that red line, crossing that red line, we ought to view every single person as part of the same body. With such an attitude, the world becomes a healthier place. The world becomes a better place because we understand that focusing on our team and seeing that there are different people on the team with different jobs and different perspectives and different ideas, and acknowledging that we need everyone, we're all limbs of the same body. We don't do the same thing. We don't have the same mission, but we do have the same collective mission. The world will become a better place when we realize that. But this still doesn't bring us to the mindset of complete unity. It still doesn't bring us to this divine mindset. Because if we see ourselves as limbs of the same body, if we see ourselves as members of the same team, we're still not one. We're members of the same team, but we're still different members. We're limbs of the same body, but we're still different limbs. Yes, we each play a particular role. Yes, we're each distinctive. And yes, that we contribute to the success and well-being of others, but we're still distinctive and we're still separate. How do we achieve the ultimate unity the way God has it in his perspective, which is that singular perspective that we're all one? And here's the fourth strategy that wraps it all together. Text 9. Our people are like a single body. A body is comprised of many limbs and arteries, some more important than others. The head and the heart are the seat of wisdom, whereas the hands and legs serve more basic needs. Similarly, with our people, each of us is joined with the others like a single body. The previous text, we were focused on the limbs and how they each complete each other. What we're focusing on here, and perhaps most importantly, this final line, each of us is joined with the others like a single body. We are focusing in on this idea that we are a single body. We're not separate people. We are a single organism, just like the limbs of a body. We are all sparks of the same God. Organs are not complementary toward another. They're part of each other. They're not separated parts of one organism. They are one organism. We don't say there is a head and there is a foot in a single body. There's a single body that has a head and a foot. It's subtle, but it's a huge difference. Does the head ever feel superior over the foot, to the foot? Does the foot feel inferior to the head? No. Why? Because they know they're one of the same body. It is the same. The foot is the head is the foot, the hand is the left hand, the right hand. It's all the body. When one limb hurts, the whole body hurts. They're all critical. And we don't dismiss parts of ourselves. We don't resent parts of ourselves. It's me. It's all part of me. It's all part of you. It's your body. So too, the Jewish people are a block, a single entity, a single greater person, if you will. And so can one hand dismiss the other hand? No. And so even if we don't agree with each other, even if we don't see each other exactly the way we see ourselves or work with each other, even when we fight with one another, we're still part of one another. When the foot is in pain, the head is in pain. This is the greatest level of unity in the divine perspective. In the prior strategies, it was depending on our common cause. We have to work together, pull together, believe together to be connected. On this level in text 9, what we're expressing is the idea that we are inherently connected. Unity is inherent to our being. It's who we are. Whether we agree with each other, whether we have the same personality traits, whether we like others' personality traits, whether they look, talk, or behave like us, it makes no difference. They're still us. On the surface, we may see the differences, but deep down, we're all one. We're all part of God. And as God is a singular entity, so are we. We may have evolved, we may have now distinctive characteristics that are different one from another, just as a difference from when a child is born from when it's an embryo until when it's born, when it's initially an embryo, there's no distinctions in different sides of it. It all looks the same. And then it gets developed and it gets there's different limbs to it. So too with the Jewish people, we started off as we're all one and the same, our root is all the same, and we may have developed into different characteristics, difference in ideas, a difference in personalities, but deep down, we're all the same, we're all singular. And once we have this understanding of our oneness, now we understand God's perspective. God's perspective that we're all one, we're all equal. And so when we stand before God and we adopt God's perspective, we discover that we are one. And so as Rosh Hashanah approaches, and we're ending this tumultuous year, the Torah that we're going to read this Shabbos, the Torah portion, is telling us, let's train ourselves to see the world as God sees it, and to see society from God's perspective, which is that we're all one. It was an interesting idea when discussing this with a colleague that came up, and that is in the Ethics of Our Fathers, it discusses that a true friendship, a true relationship is one that endures through trials and tribulations. Because it isn't dependent on anything outside. It's an inherent relationship. It's an inherent friendship. There may be differences of opinions, but it's just that. It's differences of opinions. It's not who we are. We are one and the same. The differences in opinions can't get in between our relationship with one another, our friendships with one another, our unity and closeness with one another. As it says later in this week's Torah portion, the verse tells us that why did Moses gather the people together? Why is he gathering these people, from which we glean the idea of unity through God's perspective? He gathered them together to make a covenant between them and God, so that you may enter the covenant of God, says the verse, your God, and his oath, which God your God is making with you on this day, to establish you today as his people, and he will be your God. Not only with you am I making this covenant and this oath, but with those standing here with us today before God, our God, and with those who are not here with us this day. Why'd he wait for the last day of his life to make this covenant, this bond between God and the Jewish people? The purpose of this gathering was to enter them into a covenant. Since this covenant would become effective primarily after they would cross the Jordan River into Israel, Moses postponed this gathering until the day of his passing, as close as possible to their crossing of the Jordan. So it's a technical reason why he postponed it to the last day. What's the nature of this covenant? Explains the Alter Rebbe. The idea can be explained by way of analogy. Two friends strike a covenant between them that their friendship will never end. If the factors that created their friendship would always remain in place, they would have no need for a covenant, right? Because they always like each other. If they became friends because they both had this joy in technology. And then they lose that joy in technology, so the friendship may dissipate. But if they always have that joy in technology, the friendship will always be there. So why do they strike a covenant? They strike a covenant because they fear that these factors might expire and cause their friendship to expire. The covenant forges a powerful and wondrous bond between them that transcends all reason and ensures that their friendship will never falter and that nothing will ever come between them. This way, even if something occurs that would otherwise have ended their friendship or cause enmity, the covenant ensures that their friendship perseveres. This love and intense bond covers up all sins because through it, they become one flesh. And just as one cannot stop loving oneself, so is one able to stop loving the other, unable to stop loving the other. Now, this is precisely the kind of covenant that God struck with us. He formed a bond, as it were, with us to arouse love and forgiveness. Therefore, our sins cannot separate us from God, for his nation is a portion of God. This bond, this covenant, as we mentioned, was done on the day that Moses passed away. But as we mentioned earlier, it's associated with Rosh Hashanah because it says Hayom, this day, and so it resonates every year on Rosh Hashanah. What is this covenant? We're saying that it reaches beyond personalities, it's reaching beyond sins, it's reaching beyond anything which may cause this friendship, this relationship to cease. That's what this covenant is there for, to ensure that it is an everlasting relationship. And so we have this personally, with friends and family. We have to see ourselves from God's perspective, see society from God's perspective, that we're all one. And if we're all one, we have this deep bond that no matter what happens, no matter on the perspectives or the opinions or personalities that people may have, let's look past that. Let's look over that, just like this bond enables a person to look over that mutual interest that caused the friendship in the first place. The bond enables them to look beyond that and to continue this friendship. With God, it's the same way. God strikes this covenant with the Jewish people just before they're entering Israel. And the point of the covenant was that God was telling the Jewish people, as we said in text 10, if you recall the verses from our Torah portion, it was a covenant that God made with us, that we are his people and he is our God. And who did he make this covenant with? Not only with the people standing there just before they entered into Israel, but with those standing here with us today before God our God, and with those who are not here with us this day. God made this covenant with those who were there then, led by Moses, who will then follow, being led by Joshua into the land of Israel. But God also made this covenant with you and me, the people who are not there, says the verse. You and I were not there. God made this covenant with us that he is our God and we are his people. Whether we sin or not, a covenant is beyond anything. And because it's beyond anything that may occur, God says, I am making this covenant that I am your God and you're my people, come what may. And so that is the connection between this bond and Rosh Hashanah. That on Rosh Hashanah, God says, I am striking this bond with every single generation on Rosh Hashanah. I am renewing this covenant to tell you that my relationship with you as my people transcends anything which you may do. Throughout the year, our relationship with God is a linear relationship. If we do the commandments, then we have a closer relationship with God. If we don't do the commandments or we transgress prohibitions, then we have a distanced relationship with God. Comes Rosh Hashanah and God says, no, I'm going back to this covenant and I'm re-strengthening this covenant. It's circular. It's beyond what you do and what you don't do. It's a covenant that connects me and you regardless, irrelevant of what you've been doing or what you've not been doing. A covenant that transcends rational understanding is an innate bond between us and God that is formed every year on Rosh Hashanah. On this day, we are gathered before God. We become attached to and absorbed into God, unto himself in a manner that transcends all, even the obligations of Torah and mitzvahs. And so on Rosh Hashanah, God forgives our sins and demonstrates that our bond transcends Torah and mitzvahs. That's what Rosh Hashanah is about. And so when we feel connected to God, when we activate our circular relationship with God, we naturally feel connected to our fellow, which is our circular relationship with our fellow is reestablished. In other words, when we feel our oneness with God, and on Rosh Hashanah, that's most expressed, then it becomes easier to feel the oneness with our fellow being. Which is why this Torah portion is the preparation for Rosh Hashanah. And so, to conclude, how do we work with differences that we may have with other people? We focus on this idea, the God perspective, that we're all one body. We're all part of the same. We're all one and the same. We may have difference of opinions, we have difference in ideas, we have difference of personalities, but we're all one. And if we're all one, we have to look beyond that. Practically speaking, how do we look beyond that? It's somewhat cliche and we say it all the time, but it's true. Let's focus on what we do agree with. We have a family member, a friend, someone that we may have distanced the past year because of their views or because of their ideas. Invite them over for a cup of coffee and discuss sports, discuss Bologna Creek, discuss the birds that you may have seen, discuss something that unites you. And once you're open to discussion, level-headed discussion, you'll see that you'll be able to discuss even things that you don't agree with, in ways that you can mutually accept each other's opinion and agree to disagree. But don't let it get in a way with yourself, because the Jewish people were all one. And when we realize that we're all one, and we can do that when we're standing before God in Rosh Hashanah, because we realize that us and God are one. And God sees this love that we're showing to him and to our fellow Jewish people. God will grant us a happy and a healthy, sweet new year, Shana Tova, Umetuka, and the ultimate era of unity, which will be in the era of the coming of Mashiach. May it be speedily in our days.